Why do some people slowly transform their entire life with almost invisible habits, while others keep chasing big goals but remain exactly where they started? You probably have more ambition than most people around you. Ideas come to you constantly. You imagine a better version of your life with surprising clarity. But when the moment to act arrives, the movement feels strangely slow. You promise yourself that tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow, you will finally become consistent. Yet the pattern repeats so quietly that weeks turn into months before you even notice. And the hardest part is knowing you are capable of more. This silent gap between potential and action slowly becomes exhausting. You start questioning your discipline. Sometimes you even question your character. But this struggle rarely comes from laziness, and it almost never comes from lack of intelligence. Often, it comes from misunderstanding how real change actually works. Some cultures have quietly understood this for centuries, and their approach to small daily behavior might explain more than you expect. The habit of starting. Small enough to avoid resistance. Why is it that the moment you decide to change something important, your mind suddenly becomes heavy and slow? It lowers the brain's alarm system. And once that alarm softens, beginning stops feeling like a threat. The quiet discipline of order. Most people underestimate how much mental chaos comes from physical disorder. You tell yourself the clutter around you does not matter, yet your attention feels constantly scattered. Your mind jumps between unfinished thoughts, small distractions, quiet irritations, and by the end of the day, you feel strangely drained without knowing why. Your brain is built to detect incomplete patterns. Every disorganized space silently signals unfinished work. It keeps tiny loops open in the background of your awareness. You blame yourself for lacking focus, but the environment has already fragmented it. The truth is uncomfortable. Clarity rarely begins inside the mind. It often begins outside of it. A small act of order does not feel meaningful in the moment, but your brain registers something important. A loop closes, and suddenly the next thought becomes easier to hold. Respect for the ordinary moment. What if the reason your motivation disappears is not because you lack ambition, but because you are waiting for moments that rarely exist? You keep expecting a certain emotional alignment before beginning, a sense of clarity, energy, readiness, yet most days arrive quietly, without any of those signals. The brain learns quickly when behavior depends on mood. If action requires inspiration, action becomes rare. Your mind begins to associate effort with a negotiation that never fully resolves. So you interpret this hesitation as a character flaw. It lowers the brain's alarm system. And once that alarm softens, beginning stops feeling like a threat. The quiet discipline of order. Most people underestimate how much mental chaos comes from physical disorder. You tell yourself the clutter around you does not matter, yet your attention feels constantly scattered. Your mind jumps between unfinished thoughts, small distractions, quiet irritations, and by the end of the day, you feel strangely drained without knowing why. Your brain is built to detect incomplete patterns. Every disorganized space silently signals unfinished work. It keeps tiny loops open in the background of your awareness. You blame yourself for lacking focus, but the environment has already fragmented it. The truth is uncomfortable. Clarity rarely begins inside the mind. It often begins outside of it. A small act of order does not feel meaningful in the moment, but your brain registers something important. A loop closes, and suddenly the next thought becomes easier to hold. Respect for the ordinary moment. What if the reason your motivation disappears is not because you lack ambition, but because you are waiting for moments that rarely exist? You keep expecting a certain emotional alignment before beginning, a sense of clarity, energy, readiness. Yet most days arrive quietly, without any of those signals. The brain learns quickly when behavior depends on mood. If action requires inspiration, action becomes rare. Your mind begins to associate effort with a negotiation that never fully resolves. So you interpret this hesitation as a character flaw. But meaningful movement rarely begins in extraordinary moments. It begins inside ordinary ones that you stop arguing with. When an action becomes small enough to belong to the present moment, the internal debate loses its power, and something subtle changes. You move before the mind finishes questioning it. The habit of gentle consistency. The biggest obstacle to progress is not inconsistency. It is the belief that consistency must feel intense to be meaningful. You start with pressure, expecting discipline to feel powerful and decisive. But within days, the energy fades, and you quietly fall back into the same rhythm of hesitation. Then the self-criticism begins again. Your brain does not trust behaviors that arrive with emotional extremes. Intensity signals instability. When effort feels dramatic, your mind interprets it as something temporary, so the habit never becomes safe enough to repeat. What sustains behavior is rarely force. It is emotional neutrality, a quiet repetition that does not demand motivation each time. The action stops feeling like a performance, and once that happens, continuation becomes almost automatic. The practice of respecting process over outcome. Why does your motivation collapse the moment results fail to appear quickly? You begin something with excitement, imagining the future version of yourself it might create. But when progress looks slow, a quiet disappointment settles in. Suddenly, the effort feels pointless, even though nothing has actually gone wrong. The brain is wired to chase visible reward. When results are distant, it interprets the effort as inefficient, so your mind starts searching for something more immediately meaningful. You tell yourself you simply lost interest, but the deeper truth is less dramatic. Most progress unfolds in ways the brain cannot easily measure. When attention returns to the act itself, something subtle stabilizes. The work stops depending on external proof, and strangely, that is when persistence begins to grow. The ritual of closing the day. You finish the day, close your laptop, and walk away. But your mind keeps replaying unfinished thoughts. Small tasks you forgot, conversations that felt incomplete, things you meant to do but quietly postponed. Why does the day feel like it never truly ends? The brain dislikes open loops. Every unresolved action remains active in the background of your attention, not loudly, but persistently. Over time, these fragments accumulate into a quiet cognitive weight. You interpret the fatigue as lack of discipline, when it is often just mental residue. Closure does not require dramatic productivity. It requires a boundary, a small moment where the mind registers that the day has reached its edge. Something simple enough to signal completion. When the brain senses closure, it releases what it was holding, and the next morning begins without carrying yesterday's unfinished noise. The habit of quiet improvement. What if the most powerful changes in your life happen so slowly that you almost fail to notice them? You expect transformation to feel visible, dramatic, undeniable. Yet most days pass with barely measurable progress. That quiet slowness makes you question whether anything is changing at all. The brain is attracted to dramatic shifts because they feel meaningful. But dramatic shifts are rarely stable. They demand energy that the nervous system cannot sustain for long. So the cycle repeats: intense effort, sudden fatigue, and the quiet return to old patterns. Quiet improvement works differently. It lowers the threshold of change so much that resistance never fully activates. The adjustment feels too small to matter, but the brain remembers repetition. And over time, repetition reshapes identity in ways intensity never could. The art of moving without self-judgment. One of the heaviest forces slowing you down is not fear of failure. It is the voice in your mind that comments on every attempt. You notice it after missed days, delayed work, unfinished ideas. A quiet verdict appears: you are not disciplined enough. Self-judgment feels like accountability, but psychologically it does the opposite. The brain associates the activity with emotional discomfort. So the next time you approach the task, resistance appears earlier. Not because you dislike the work, but because you dislike the feeling of failing again. Most people believe harsh self-criticism will push them forward. In reality, it often freezes movement entirely. Progress becomes possible again when the mind stops turning every attempt into evidence. When effort no longer feels like a test of character, and in that quieter space, movement returns without needing permission. Guilt was never the engine of real change. It only convinces you that something inside you is broken. Shame keeps you circling the same thought, I should have done more. I should be further by now. But that voice doesn't create movement. It freezes it. Real continuation begins somewhere quieter, not in punishment, not in harsh discipline, but in the simple willingness to stop fighting yourself long enough to keep going. Self-compassion is not an excuse to stay the same. It is the condition that allows you to move without carrying the weight of constant self-judgment. Because who you are has never been the same thing as what you've been doing. The hesitation, the unfinished plans, the slow starts. Those are patterns, not identity. Psychology has a quiet way of repeating patterns until they feel personal. You begin to believe the loop is who you are. But loops are learned, and learned patterns can be interrupted, not with force, with awareness that is calm enough to see the pattern without becoming it. This is the paradox that sits at the center of everything you've heard so far. Understanding yourself deeply does not automatically create action, and discipline without compassion slowly collapses under its own pressure. So the shift rarely begins with something dramatic. It begins with something almost invisible, a small action, done imperfectly, without waiting for the emotional permission you've been searching for. Not to prove anything, just to teach the brain something new. That movement is still possible, that the system can start again. At this point, it can feel like the story is complete. You see how tiny habits change the rhythm of a life. You understand why small rituals matter more than dramatic bursts of motivation. You recognize the quiet intelligence behind those 8 subtle practices. But here's the part most people miss. Awareness itself can become another form of stillness. And this is where awareness quietly turns into another trap. Because even when you understand the habits, even when you see the patterns clearly, something inside can still remain strangely unmoved. The mind continues analyzing while life waits for motion. That tension is not accidental. It is the deeper psychology behind why some people are both ambitious and strangely inactive at the same time. The layer where insight does not automatically translate into movement. The layer where understanding can become a hiding place rather than a doorway. And when you look back at those 8 tiny Japanese habits that seem so simple, a different question begins to appear. Not what they are, but why so many intelligent, self-aware people can see them clearly and still remain exactly where they are.